Hi y'all, welcome to The Handmaid's Tale. Today we're going to be discussing and really uncovering all the details about The Handmaid's Tale. So I'm first going to give you some background information about the author, the time period, before we really get into the synopsis. So Margaret Atwood, she's the author. She's a Canadian author, poet, and literary critic. Her novels often explore feminist perspectives and complex social and political themes, which are very clearly highlighted in The Handmaid's Tale. So The Handmaid's Tale was published in 1985. The genre is dystopian or speculative fiction. It's set in the near future of a dystopian United States. Now let's get into the synopsis. The novel is set in a future totalitarian society known as Gilead, a Christian fundamentalist regime. The society is experiencing an infertility crisis, and the novel is narrated by Offred, a handmaid assigned to bear children for the commanders and the wives, who are the elite in Gilead. The handmaids are solely used to give birth, and the women are dehumanized and illustrated as objects. The book is constantly going back and forth from the present to flashbacks of Offred's past, before and during the Gilead age. Through her perspective, Offred accounts for the constant oppression and brutality forced upon her and those around her, and the consequences of anyone who might challenge the regime.
She seeks to
Margaret
maintain
Atwood,
her sense of identity in hopes that she will once see her daughter and husband Luke again. After being stripped apart, these memories of the past serve as a stark contrast to her reality and allow her to survive. There is a training facility called the Red Center, Rhea and Leah Center, where she's taken and brainwashed by Aunt Lydia and Aunt Elizabeth. Her best friend and symbol of freedom, Moira, is also taken there, where the two reunite until Moira escapes. Offred creates many forbidden relationships with not only the commander, in which he allows her to read and play Scramble, which is also strictly against rules, but also with Nick, who is a member of the household staff. Later in the novel, they also begin a romantic relationship. Towards the end, Offred joined the fight against the regime, becoming part of the underground rebellion group called Mayday. The Handmaid's Tale explores themes such as the objectification of women, the misuse of religion, and the importance of individuality. Margaret Atwood uses this novel to send a message that illustrates the future consequences of our society's choices and what not to do in order to avoid societal anguish.
Okay, so for this role, we kind of have three main themes. So the first main theme that we see throughout the book is the role and oppression of women. So throughout The Handmaid's Tale, we kind of see that Gilead put together this society that's based on a fertility hierarchy, which means that people who can have children are at the highest, while people who can't are at the lowest. So this kind of allows Atwood to convey her abuse of women and their bodies. So we see that women's bodies are now used as political instruments in a sense where they can now help further the population. Instead of being seen as actual people, they're seen as mothers. So that contributes to kind of this issue that we see of importance of individuality, where people are seen more for what they can contribute to society based on like their biology, based on like instead of like their intellect. We can also see this in the salvagings based on that they are separated by sex to show that in the society of Gilead, being a man is very different from being a woman in a sense where even something such as the public execution, it's separated and divided. So the second thing that we see is the complexity of love. So we see a lot of forbidden relationships. There are more platonic relationships, such as the commander, between the commander and Offred, where they read together and they are allowed to play Scrabble together. But there are also more romantic forbidden relationships, such as with Nick, who's the driver for the household staff. So these forbidden relationships are really driven by her memories of past love, because it shows that what she was able to have before Gilead is kind of what she's striving for now, in a sense where she's allowed to do this and she sees what her relationship with her husband was like, so she kind of strives for that with Nick. And then the third theme is loneliness and isolation. So we see a lot of what Gilead has put together. It completely prohibits any any physical or emotional relationship that's not allowed by the government. So we see that, and that kind of, we can see that it results in a lot of isolation. So this is really emphasized, or Atwood really emphasizes this by using internal dialogue, because it shows that it shows Offred's like struggle with this and how she struggles a lot with loneliness and also suicidal thoughts. So for this role,
Atwood employs a multitude of authorial choices throughout the novel. Here we have 4 of the main authorial choices and devices that she uses, starting with figurative language. So figurative language is across the entirety of the novel, and the whole novel is experienced through the narrator's mind. So it highly relies on imagery, which is lots of physical description and flashbacks of Offred, the narrator. It uses visual, auditory, and olfactory imagery to create an unsettling experience for the reader that mirrors the actual experiences within the novel and the Gilead Society. So here an example is lots of vivid description of the brutality and violence that the handmaids and the rest of society endure. So for example, the Red Center, which we'll go more depth later in the video, and the wall. This quote uses a lot of figurative language to display Offred's pain and internal conflict when addressing the idea of being put on the wall for her rebellious nature. Using the imagery of her head faceless, oblong of white cloth, displays the wings on the side of her head, kind of shielding her from the rest of society, showing that idea of oppression and control that the Gilead Society has over her. Similarly, she's placing herself as to be a doll hung on the wall, so she's almost like a pawn in the game of the Gilead regime. Once again, the allusion to a wingless angel, she feels as though if she breaks the law, or if she does what she wants, she will be oppressed and then sent onto the wall and killed. Well, on that note, let's move on to setting. Setting in this novel builds a paranoid atmosphere and really creates the experience of living within Gilead, similar to the figure of language. Similar to figure of language, the setting also employs a lot of description, obviously, and it places the reader within the actual context of the characters within the novel. Some of the main setting we see is the commander's office, which is a setting of rebellion and a place of Offred's forbidden relationships with the commander, and also her relationship with reading, which is forbidden in the Gilead Society for women. Similarly, the Rachel and Leah Center. So this is an old secondary school which is surrounded by barbed wire, and it is inspired by Rachel and Leah, whose biblical tale inspired the idea of the handmaids. You can do more research on that on your own. They are forced into training here in the center, which is similar to the breeding of the handmaids. So this training is violent and very mentally destructive, and causes this like brainwashing effect on the woman. So this setting displays the strict surveillance, brutality, and control of the Gilead Society, which is displayed throughout the novel and is constantly flashback to in Offred's narration. It increases this tenuous mood and provides a striking imagery of the physical and mental violence that the handmaids endure. And lastly, Offred's room, which is a key setting throughout the novel. It's virtually her prison, and she feels as though she is constantly being watched. This blind past her eye is the ceiling of her room, and it feels like she's constantly being watched. This imagery and the setting of being placed where eyes are watching her is very important to the overall feeling of paranoia and oppression that the handmaids and Offred.
Next, we have symbolism. So the symbols represent and highlight the oppression and dehumanization of women, but also signify Offred's pursuit for individuality and freedom. We see this mainly through the symbols of Scrabble, flowers, and the color red. All right, lastly, and arguably the most important symbol of all, so if you don't remember anything, try to remember the color red. The color red symbolizes the fertility, blood, this idea of stolen and forced identity of the handmaids. So this quote, I get up out of the chair, advance my feet into the sunlight, in their red shoes, flat-heeled to save the spine and not for dancing. The red gloves are lying on the bed. I pick them up, pull them onto my hands, finger by finger. Everything except the wings around my face is red, the color of blood which defines us. The color red symbolizes both the blood that defines the women's biological purpose and the violence and control imposed upon them, as the red shoes and gloves represent their restricted roles and identities within a society that reduces them to their reproductive functions. The mention of wings around my face further underscores the suffocating, dehumanizing nature of their existence.
What else does The Handmaid's Tale remind you of?
I don't know, maybe blindness or Pride and Prejudice?
Yes!
Okay, one text that connects to The Handmaid's Tale is Blindness by Jose Saramago. So this kind of follows the epidemic of blindness that happens in this unknown city that's fictitious. So one reasons why this can be connected is through the role and oppression of women. So in The Handmaid's Tale, we already kind of talked about it, but there's this hierarchy based on fertility where women's bodies are used. Similarly in blindness, women are used as objects for men, as some prisoners realize, or some people in the ward realize that they can have like this advantage and they can demand women. So in this way that women are used as more objects for like sex compared to The Handmaid's Tale, which they're more used as objects for babies and fertility in a sense. So now we have the second connection, which Tori will talk about, and is the complexity of love.
In blindness, there is also a similar theme of the complexity of love in forbidden relationships. So in The Handmaid's Tale, it's seen through Nick and Offred, and also Offred and the Commander. And similar to blindness, the girl with the dark glasses and the old man. So their relationships are sort of like would not be like tolerated in society because of like the age gaps. And also there's this sense of like secrecy between like the girl with the dark glasses and like the old man compared to like Nick and Offred, which they sort of almost hide their relationship from society because obviously it would not be like accepted.
In Pride and Prejudice, how do we see this?
Yeah, so in Pride and Prejudice, we also see the complexity of love.
Very
Crazy.
true.
So it's mostly satire and irony of Darcy's infatuation with Elizabeth after he previously saw her as merely intolerable.
Yeah.
As well as the societal views on love, such as Charlotte and Mr. Collins was seen as necessary, not really her choice.
Mm-hmm.
And then also another theme would be identity.
Yes.
Elizabeth stays true to herself and her beliefs despite what society thinks or what her mother wants her to do.
Yeah, similar to how like Offred tries to, keep her identity, because she's not just a handmaid. She tries to keep her past identity by using flashbacks and such. So
Exactly.
I think these are great ways to connect it.
Yeah.
What else?
Look at possible paper 2 questions that we could receive during the examination. So for the other Westmore, we could receive the guiding question. The theme of identity is frequently used in literature to highlight a character's growth. Using 2 works, explore the impact of identity on the characterization of characters in the text. So there are multiple different ways that we could really address this question, but one of the ways that we outlined this question was by comparing and contrasting isolation and identity, and really focusing on how they differ in their progression of character development. So our introduction would encompass a short synopsis of both texts where we would focus a lot on the identity of the character. So we would talk about both Wesses and their struggle with identity and their kind of lives that are intermingled with crime, and then we could talk about The Handmaid's Tale and about how women separate their ability to have children from who they are. And then we would have our thesis statement, and then we would kind of split the essay into 2 parts where we would compare how both authors really portray this theme of isolation and how their identity and their lack and their struggling with how they identify really impact this isolation. And we can contrast them by showing that Moore really allows the readers to see a more progression of character development, while Atwood shows us one interpretation of Alfred. We can now look at blindness, and a guiding question that we could connect The Handmaid's Tale and blindness to are, to what extent and in what ways is the role of women portrayed in two different works you have read? So similar to the other essay, we would bisect this essay by having a compare and contrast section, where we would talk about how both books really show this abuse of women. And because in The Handmaid's Tale there is the rape and the abuse of these women's bodies, and similarly in blindness we also have this with the prisoners in the ward. But then we can contrast it by showing the societal roles, where women are seen as women in Gilead who can have babies are seen as higher than those who cannot. While in blindness we kind of have this difference where women are still seen as objects, but the doctor's wife is seen almost as above everybody else because she has their sight. And similar to the other essay, we would have a 1 to 2 sentence synopsis of each text, our thesis statement, and then we would have our compare and contrast sections, and then we'd have our conclusion. So these are just two possible questions that we could connect to The Handmaid's Tale during our paper 2.